My name is Philip Morley. I'm a custom furniture maker in Wimberley, Texas. I build unique, one-of-a-kind pieces of furniture. With the T-Rack, it's a little bit different as far as conventional woodworking goes. You actually do the tenons first. And so once you have your parts machined to final dimensions and cut to final length, the length is important here because we're going to reference the top of this and we're going to cut a 3/4 inch tenon on either side. And so this is ultimately what we're trying to go for. We're going to cut a nice clean tenon in the workstation. And so I'm going to set up a grid using the back side of this piece. So the back side is always the reference side, which is important just in case for some reason your stock is not all the same thickness. What we do is we're going to do one tenon and then we're going to rotate and do the other tenon. And so if you end up flipping it like this, you could have tenons that are a little bit off. Okay, once I've scanned the surface, so the workstation here, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set a new grid. And since I'm setting up from the back side, I'm going to go and change it. So right now it's got it on the opposite side. So I'm just going to change that so that it's referencing that back edge. So gently come up against it. And now our last point is right on the corner. And it's nice to have your piece of wood in the location that you're actually going to be cutting so that when you scan it, you see that piece of wood too. And it just gives you that kind of confidence like, okay, it looks right. So right now this back corner is my grid. So now that I've got that done, I'm going to change out the bit before I forget, put it in properly, and then import the design for the tenon. Okay, so now I'm in design, I'm going to import. So I'm going to select my tenon, this actually has a custom anchor point too. So there's two different ways you can locate it on the actual stock itself. So I could use this custom anchor point, or I could just use any point on here to set it. So I'm going to go ahead and use this anchor point. So now we can kind of look at it and make sure that looks right and looks centered on there. That looks good. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into cut and we're doing a pocket cut. So I'm going to do this in like 1/4 inch increments. We're going to 3/4, so 1/4, half, and 3/4 all the way around. We're going to pocket this out, and that's how we're going to get down and close to the tenon. And then the last pass we're going to do at full depth is cut around the tenon itself. Now that we have all the tenons done on the shelves, it's time to actually cut the mortises on the sides. So this is where it's a little bit backwards. Typically you do your mortising then fit the tenon, but it's actually a lot easier to fit this tenon that we already have made by making adjustments on the mortise itself. And so we'll cut the mortise, be able to bring this to it, test it, and adjust if we need to. Okay, for doing the sides themselves, I made this, I guess you could call it a jig. It basically sandwiches out so that it's the same height, same thickness as our workpiece. So our router is very secure and steady on here. This works really nice if you're doing more than one of these. A few things to mention about this jig is what we're going to do is we're going to rescan and then we're going to set a grid and we're going to use the end here and then this edge here. This is my reference edge. So when I put the part in, the front edge is always facing me. It's really important that you do a left and a right. It's a pretty easy mistake to make. It's just going ahead and cutting both of them in the same orientation and then you end up with 2 lefts or 2 rights. We have a center line here. And so I basically measured my piece, 34, and put 17. And so now that these parts are wide, so they're long, the final thickness, final width, which you can leave it an 1/8 inch over if you want to just trim that front edge later on, because sometimes you will possibly get a little bit of blowout when you start profiling the edges. But I'm just going to put a rough center mark in this piece. And that way I know I'm going to get the part within this. So we're just going to use some double stick tape. It's a good idea to pick out, if you have a preference, what's the left, what's the inside, outside face, and what's the front edge. So I usually do that just with some type of mark so I know exactly how this piece should be orientated. And so now I've got the double stick tape. I'm just lining those center lines up. I've done this before, so the nice thing with the ShaperOrigin, as soon as the camera sees the tape, it knows of this workstation. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to act like this is the first time I'm doing it. And we're just going to rescan and do a grid again. That's why I like having my workpiece there. It's just kind of reassurance, like, okay, that is 0 right in that corner, and you can see it lining up to the edge of my piece. I'm gonna go ahead and choose my anchor. Let's see, I'm gonna use the center back edge. And since we did the grid, you can see on here, the grid is actually referencing off of this jig. I have it marked here, my center is 17 inches. And so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna place, so we can zoom in and we can see it's right on that back edge, it's in the center. Okay, so we're placing our file, and since we set the grid off this back edge and this corner here, that's what this arrow is about, I know from here to my center, it's 17 inches. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut the mortises out. The way I like to go about it is, I'm gonna do basically 1/4 inch increments. I mean, I know this is 5/8, so I'm gonna do a 1/4 inch, then I'm gonna go to a 1/2 inch, and then I'm actually gonna go to 0.625 plus a 32nd, so I make sure I cut all the way through. So now that we have all the mortises done, it's time to test that fit. So I've got my tenon, and this is, you can see why this is easier to do. I can just come to this, and yes, it starts, but it's very snug. I'm just gonna do a little bit of an offset, probably 0.002, and that's gonna be in the minus, so it's gonna just a small clean-up cut. When I do the very last cut, I'm gonna go a little bit slower, so I'm just keeping it really steady as I go around, and it tends to give me the best result. So I'm gonna do one, test it, and if I need to go a little bit more, I'll just kind of do that and judge it from that particular one. But I think 0.002 is gonna be enough. All right, so that is kind of fit I'm looking for. I mean, I want it to be snug. I don't want to be sloppy, but then at the same time, if it's too tight, you're gonna end up breaking something. And so this seems, that's gonna work pretty well. I could take off a little bit more, but I'm gonna leave it as that. I prefer to have it a little bit snug than having any gaps. Now that we have the mortises done and we're happy with them, there's 2 more operations to do. We have the little 1/4 inch holes that we need to do, and I go a 1/4 inch deep for that. That's gonna be for that brass rod. So I'm gonna go ahead and just peck those out. And then it's the profile. So I'm only doing the top and the bottom profile here. I'll show you what I typically do. So it's gonna be this edge here, because the router's gonna come around like this. And so when I come this way to me, pulling it to me, this front edge is what's likely to blow out a little bit. And so I'm actually gonna go right to that point, and I'm gonna peck all the way down slowly at 5/8, and that should help with some of that blowout. Since this is only 5/8 thick, it's pretty quick to get through. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna do the same type of deal I did the mortises. I'm gonna go 1/4, 1/2, and then I'm gonna go to that 5/8. So another way you could go about it, and this I use a lot in my shop with thicker material, or if it's a larger perimeter that I'm working on, is I'll only go a 1/4 inch deep. And so I'll do an offset, go around 1/4 inch deep, then do another, minus, take away the offset, and then do my final cut at a 1/4 inch deep, and then go to the bandsaw, and I'll bandsaw that off, and then that 1/4 inch I did is a resting place for the bearing for a flush trim bit. So I'll go to the route table and flush trim it up. It just saves you a lot of time, as you can imagine, with a big piece, so it's a great way to do it too. So now that we have our side completed, and so this would technically be the right. And I mentioned before, like, it's really important that you do a left and a right, and it's because of these holes. If these holes went all the way through, it just wouldn't matter, but they don't. And so you don't want to end up with 2 lefts or 2 rights. So the way I like to do this, instead of going, like, you could get rid of this file, import a new file. I'm actually gonna go back into design. I'm gonna copy this file. I'm gonna flip it over and put it exactly where I need it. And the reason I like doing that is, if you're doing multiple of these, you can get pretty lost with, like, wait, did I do a left or do a right? This gives you a real visual on screen, like, okay, yes, that's correct. Now let me delete this one and get rid of it. All right, so now we have this side done. I'll go ahead and just repeat the same process and get the other side completed. So there we have it. We have a left and a right, and they both look great. So now, whilst I still have this set up, I've got to take 2 of my shelves, basically the top and the bottom, and on the back side, there's going to be a 1/4 inch groove cut into this. And so for doing this, I'm going to find the center of my individual shelves, and I went ahead and just picked some random numbers, but I picked 9 inches and 21 inches. So one thing I forgot to mention, when I cut this tenon, I had this profile in that same file. So you can see that little edge profile there. So I went ahead and I actually used my 1/4 inch bit on the outside of the perimeter, and I just cut about a 30-second down. What that will do is it will allow me later on to transfer these lines and give me an edge to do this by hand. The reason I'm pointing it out now is it's important you know, like, that's the front edge, and this shelf sits like this. And so if you end up putting the tape on the wrong way, you're gonna mess up. So the shelf sits like this, the groove has to happen on the bottom side here, not on this side. And so I'm just gonna lay this out on here, make sure those centers are lined up to those marks, and then since we already have this gridded from this reference face and from the end, when I bring the file in to cut that groove, it's really easy for me just to line it up again, the center, back edge. This only goes a 1/4 inch deep, so I'm just gonna do one pass. The last part of the T-rack are the brackets, and this length is the shoulder to shoulder cut. So let me show you what I mean by that. We have the overall length, which is from the end of the tenon end to the tenon, and then the shoulder to shoulder is here. So this length has to be cut perfectly to that. What we want is this to be nice and clean. And I'm probably just gonna bandsaw the rest of this off and then flush trim it. Now we're on to the part which I enjoy honestly the most, is treating the edges and sanding. It might sound weird, a lot of people hate the sanding process, but if you take a little bit of time and have a good understanding what it means to get a good surface for finish, it can make or break a piece. You could spend a lot of time doing all the fancy joinery, have a good design, and rush through the whole sanding process, and it shows at the end of the piece. I like to do all the machine work. So my tool's dragging over it, I go to the router table, anything I'm doing that my piece is dragging over, I get that done first. So that line just kind of giving me a visual to, where to cut down to. I'm going to use a longer plane. You could do this with a block plane and you'll probably be fine, but the idea is that the smaller the plane is, you can get off a little bit, right? Where this guy is gonna stay on there nice and flat, and I can work this across. So I'm gonna set up for a coarser cut and then make it finer as I get closer to the desired shape. I'm gonna back off on that cut now, make a finer cut. And any profile, it's basically facets. All I'm doing is I'm making these facets and I'm trying to make them as small as I can, and then the sanding is gonna really blend that in. So you can kind of see that shape. That's pretty much what I'm looking for. So now it's time to sand. So I'm going to start with 120 and work my way up through the grits. It's not a bad idea to pencil. I started up higher, and as I'm going sanding this, I started rotating it until I saw that line just disappearing. Once I saw that, I stopped because I know I'm at that hard line. I don't want to go any further than that. I don't particularly do the pencil thing every time. I can kind of trust my eye, but it's a good visual, especially if you're not used to doing this type of work. So this is piece 220 and a little piece of cardboard, a little notepad from like the back of a notepad, it's a nice thickness. It gives it just a little bit of rigidity, and then I'm going to use this and kind of to form it, and that's going to really blend any of those facets. And you can tell by just wiping off the dust, if there's some like cloudiness, that means you haven't sanded it enough. So you need to like go back. Okay, so the last thing I'm doing is this flex paper. So 320, I like to cut it up into little squares. And this stuff just works really nice to finish it out. Okay, so here's the finished result I was looking for. This looks really nice, crisp, and you can tell it's been sanded very well. So now I'm going to just demonstrate pretty much the same thing I did on the shelf, but profiled in the top edge here and then this bottom edge. You could use a guide block, a marking gauge. Honestly, just use your finger and a pencil. Measurement is not really important. Just go with what you think looks nice. I think for this it's around 3/16 to 1/4, so I'm just going to guide that line. It's just giving me a point where I know to work down towards, and this is on the inside because this rolls inward, and then basically just going to go something like that, which is kind of rolling off. I'm also going to mark a center line. Again, it's just a guide to like help me know how far I'm going. And for this, we're going to use just a flat bottom spoke shave. We've got to be careful on the way out. If I just come all the way, I'm going to blow out on the back side. So I'm going to work it both ways. And I'm going to skew it up a little bit so I'm cutting through the fibers instead of dragging across it. Now I've got the rough shape. I'm just going to go ahead and start tackling it with some sandpaper. This is a good example so I can see a little bit of tear out here. So if I moved on with my other grits, even though you can just about see it now, once you get to 220, it's really going to pop. And then that's that same door, you're like, I don't want to go back to 120, when really you should. So if you see it now, you got to train your eye to like catch it before you move on. So I need to work a little harder to get rid of it now. You can see, I mean, it looks really clean. There's no kind of gray modeling where there's scratches and stuff. It's just very clean. I'm going to show this too because it's a little bit different because it has the curve. And so I'll show you that also. So it's important that you're working downhill. And what I mean by that, the grain's coming out this way. If I go cutting this way, I'm kind of working against that grain and it's going to want to tear out of me. If I cut down like so, it's going to just give me a better result. Curved bottom spoke shave is always a little bit tricky. You got to find that balance, but that looks pretty good. The rest will get done with sanding. So for this shape, so on the very end here, it's angled this way. It's going to roll back too. I'm actually going to go ahead and use a rasp. So this rasp, kind of like a bunch of hacksaw blades. There's a coarse and a fine. We're going to work our way to that line. Make sure we don't go all the way across where we blow this out. I'm really happy with how that came out. Now that we have the top, the bottom done, really it's just one quick hand plane across the top edge. Don't want to go too far because you know your dowels, I mean, you'd be going really far if you hit that dowel. The dowel's about a quarter inch away from the top. A couple hits with hand plane, 220, ease the inside edge. And then like I said, nothing happens on the outside, but then on the inside, I'm just going to come to my table with my random orbital sander. Before we can glue this up, there's a couple things we need to do. One, just make sure that you've sanded all your parts, the inside. It's really difficult to sand it after the fact. And so we're good there, but we have to make our wedges. So we split the tenon on the bandsaw, so just cutting a little curve. When this goes down in there, the wedge is actually parallel to the grain, which is really the wrong way. You want it perpendicular to the grain. So what could happen is if I really smash the heck out of that wedge, especially up around here, it's going to wedge open, it's going to split this and potentially down here too. So keep in mind what this is, it's a T-rack. It's just going to hold tea or coffee. And so this is really more decorative. If there's a little bit of a gap in the width, it's going to help us, but you don't want to drive home too hard on this. The simple approach, how I do it in my shop, is basically, I mean, this is a really long piece, but I'm going to take a chunk, I'm going to do walnut. I'm going to take a chunk of this. It has to be around 12, 13 inches because that's what it takes to go through my planer. I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to join it, probably resaw it to 5 3/4 say, and then I'm going to like plane it down until it fits perfect, as if it's a tenon, until it fits perfect within this mortise. Once that's done, I'll determine the length of my tenon. So I have this piece that fits perfectly in there, and then I'll just chop maybe 1.5 inch pieces out of that. And I'll make a very simple jig with a piece of plywood on the bandsaw that will cut those wedges. So this is how this works. It's really not fancy at all. We're gonna come like so, cut through, make one cut, rotate, make another cut. Once this block starts getting too close, at a certain point, I'm just not gonna bother getting any more. But then I'll also use my pencil just to hold that in so my fingers are not getting anywhere close to that blade. It's just very efficient to get very consistent wedges. Now we need to think about our brass rods. To cut the brass, I'm just going to use a hacksaw to do it. Now we're ready for glue up. I always like to just mentally go through the process of what I need. This is pretty simple. However, as you know, as soon as you start spreading glue, things swell up a little bit and you don't want to be running around trying to get your clamps. So I've got my clamps here. If I do need to grab some more for some reason, it's not like my shop's that big, I can go grab one. I've got some hot water and a toothbrush, just in case I get glue squeeze out, I can clean that up real well. Obviously glue, my wedges are ready, my little hammer to drive it, and my little brush. So I'm pretty much good to go. We're not spreading glue in the mortise because you're just gonna pour it right out, especially when you push this down. So we're just gonna put it on the actual tenon itself. And I'm gonna try not to go all the way to the shoulder, So again, when you push this in, it's going to scrape up a little bit. Easing these edges, no matter if it's a through tenon or just a regular house tenon, it's always a good idea so that it doesn't scrape glue all the way to the bottom. It's just good practice. Another nice thing about pre-finishing is any glue squeeze out, you just let it sit for 15 minutes and then it just peels right off. So we need to make sure we get in there with a toothbrush and clean any of that glue. Alright, so I want to do a visual, make sure everything's closed up tight. Everything looks really good. We do have glue squeeze out we need to deal with, but I'm going to go ahead and get wedges in. So this is the easier side to get the wedges in, so I'm going to start here. I'm just going to put a little bit of glue on the tip, so I'll get both going at the same time and just go back and forth. Again, you're not going crazy with these. You can hear that pitch change. So that's it, that's all we need. Although I kind of said the wedges are not structural, they obviously add an element of structure to this tenon, but basically if there's any gap in the width of this, it's closing that up and it's going to make it stay together incredibly strong. It's somewhat of a mechanical fastener because we don't have a lot of long grain to long grain glue surface here, because most of this connection is end grain to long grain. But again, keep in mind, wedges typically go perpendicular to the grain. We could have done that here, it just doesn't look very good. So it's part decorative. Yes, it does help structurally, but if you just go smashing this in, you're gonna split something. So as that wedge goes in, it's making this nice and tight. It's important you make sure you get that glue now, because if you don't, once it dries, it's kind of hard to see, and then when you put finish on, it's really easy to see, you'll notice it. So just a toothbrush, some hot water, and then just a clean towel. But you really want to get aggressive, and what I'm looking for, I'm watching the glue disappear. And that way, I'm not spreading that glue in the fibers, I'm getting it out of there. And then I use the paper towel just to kind of run back over it. And later on, I'll have to hit it again with a little bit of 320. It's not a big deal. All right, so here's the finished piece. This one, as you can see, the cherry is really dark. This is a few years old, and that's the beautiful thing about using just a natural finish. It will oxidize, so this will get even darker in time, just naturally. And so I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for coming out to my studio.